Okay, so I also want to talk about, there's several studies that show that a listener's belief about who the speaker is can affect the perception of pronunciation, not only at that global level of, oh, they sound foreign, but even to the level of details about their pronunciation. So my idea about who you are may affect details of the pronunciation that I perceive. And I'm going to skip over, am I? Yes, I am. I'll go ahead and skip over a bunch of studies that have been done that show this, but that are not dealing with native, non-native situation. And I'll skip to one that student Gloria Hu and I did together on perception of specific details of non-native accent depending upon beliefs about the speaker's nationality. Yeah. So, and this one, folks who've read some of the other studies will recognize the methodology from Nancy Nijelski's study. It's very similar. But anyway, the first thing we did is we had to look at what people's expectations were. So our study was conducted in Guangzhou in China, where people speak Cantonese. That's the native variety there. And they have a stereotype of their own English as being cut off at the ends of words like book, so that the K isn't fully pronounced even when the word is pronounced in isolation. So you get, it's like book rather than book, for example. That's the stereotype. Okay, Cantonese people say book. They cut off the ends of words. On the other hand, they stereotype native U.S. English as being perfect. I'm perfect. Okay, so they have different beliefs here. So for the experiment, we gave Cantonese study participants a list of sentences. Each sentence has a key word in it, like book, something that has a word final stop for the linguists here in it. And that keyword is underlined. And they listen to a recording of a speaker, a native speaker of English, incidentally, a recording of a speaker reading the sentence, and then it's followed by 3 versions of the keyword. One that's essentially book, kind of the Cantonese stereotype, one with it fully pronounced, book, essentially this stereotype they have about American English, and then one that's kind of in between, book, essentially with a released but unaspirated stop, again for linguists. And then they chose which of the 3 versions of the keyword matched how it was pronounced in the sentence. So we'd say, you know, how did the person say book? Did they say book, book, or book? And then, of course, the fun part was one group of listeners was told that the speaker was Cantonese. The other group of speakers was told that she was American. So what happened? If listeners thought they were listening to American, they were much more likely to choose the fully pronounced version. So if they thought they were hearing an American, they thought that she said book. Listeners who were listening to the same speaker, if they were told that she was Cantonese, when they heard the word book, they thought they heard the cut-off version. If they thought they were listening to a Cantonese speaker, they heard book, the Cantonese stereotype. Now this is kind of interesting because words like book in the context of a sentence are not usually going to be aspirated like that, right? So in native English speech, I wouldn't say, I bought a book yesterday or something. I wouldn't necessarily usually fully aspirate it like that. So the Cantonese stereotype was actually a little more accurate for how Americans pronounce it as well. So there's not really a big difference. There can be sometimes, but not nearly as big as they think. So, some implications of this. We have a stigmatized pronunciation. In this case, how that sound, that K sound, for example, is pronounced at the end of the word. It's noticed if it's spoken by a stigmatized speaker, in this case a non-native speaker of English. It's not noticed if it's spoken by a non-stigmatized speaker. Same feature, we notice it if it's in a non-native accent, but not when native speakers do the same thing. Now, to me, this is actually extra problematic because even if you know that there's a tendency toward bias, right? You go back and listen to that tape again. Well, did she really say book, or was that just my stereotype? Notice my funny foreign accent when I said book? No? Right, because it wasn't that funny, right? It's normal pronunciation, not cut off. But if you go back and carefully listen to that speaker to see, do they have that problem? Did they really cut off their Ks? Be like, why, yes, they did. See, I wasn't being biased. It's really there. You can measure it. Well, that's, great, but we may not then go back and listen to our supposed model, the native speakers, and realize that that problem is actually, so-called problem, is a feature of native speech as well. So, to bring it back to the Arizona situation, something like the presentation of comma as coma is seen as a problem if it's produced because it's associated with a non-native speaker, specifically speaker Spanish. But we don't hear him talking about problems with pronunciation of pen as pin, which does sometimes lead to miscommunication, but since about half the country probably says it that way, we kind of let it slide. Not to mention, what about people pronouncing caught as cot? That's one you don't really hear people railing against. Even though I personally was very disappointed once when I thought I was going to be hearing Don McLean, you know, the American Pie guy, and it turned out it was some woman named Dawn McLean. So, you know, these could all lead to miscommunication, but they're not rated equally. The ones that are rated as problematic are the ones that are associated with non-native speech. So just to sum up, listeners' expectations of the speaker can influence perception of their pronunciation, and depending on how their expectations influence their actual behavior, as in that first study that I talked about, those expectations can also lead to poorer communication, or at least the appearance of poorer communication. And people are usually not really aware of these effects, as we were just hearing about. Often what they think are common sense, that's one word that Superintendent Horn likes to use, it's very common sense. Things that people think are common sense or obvious judgments can be biased. And this can happen even when people's intention is essentially positive. So even if they're not out to, you know, it doesn't have to require, I am out to get, you know, whatever this group is. Even when people are, you know, intending or think they're intending to be benign, they could still be doing this. We could still be doing this. So therefore, I would argue that assessments of speaker proficiency can't be made fairly in an impressionistic fashion, especially without substantial linguistic knowledge of the languages involved. So you can't just go in and say, oh, this person was incomprehensible without paying attention to the full situation, without knowing a little bit about how language works. You can't go in and say, they pronounce this word funny without realizing, well, maybe a lot of other folks pronounce this word funny and I might not have noticed because they're white, in a word. So, moral of the story is, Arizona, please hire more linguists. Thank you.